I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I'm your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is Patrick Wyman, and we are here. Very happy to be here with, inarguably, one of the most respected trainers in the world of mixed martial arts, and one of the most interesting people, Greg Jackson, head coach at Jackson Winkeljohn MMA Academy in Albuquerque. Greg, thank you so much. It's an honor and a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me on. The honor is mine.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Well, Greg, we mostly focus on technique, training, strategy, things like that, in the cage, in the ring stuff on this show. And you are, of course, known as one of the best game planners, one of the best strategizers in all of MMA. Can you kind of walk us through the process of how you come up with, say, one of your fighters gets a fight booked, what's the first thing you do when you start preparing for that opponent?
Lots of heavy drinking. That's usually the first thing I do right off the bat. Like, oh, here we go again. No, it's pretty standard. I think most teams do it. We once we find out, okay, this is the opponent, then we say, okay, well, we need to take a look at some tape and find out what we know about this person, and so then it's just a matter of knowing it's the old maxims, right? They always come back to haunt us. Know your fighter. So what are they capable of? Know your opponent. What are their tendencies? What do they look for? What do they psychologically hold on to? All of those kind of factors. And you learn that by watching tapes. I usually start in my tape process with the old fights first. They're early fights to see what habits they have kind of early on. Because people, as they get better fighters, learn to mask those mistakes or mask those tendencies with other techniques, and so it becomes a layered approach. So I try to get at the baseline, kind of mine through the strata, if you will, to find the kind of the heart of what they'll go to and what they'll do when they're pushed or when they're winning. So I start that process, and sometimes it's very easy to see, sometimes it's not as easy to see, but that's what I try to do, and then formulate a game plan based on my fighter's abilities. Are they going to be able to match this? Can they do that? And the plan kind of evolves from there. I get a lot of input from all the other coaches that are much smarter than I am, thank goodness. And I get a lot of their opinions and the fighter themselves, and kind of an amalgamation of all of that. And then we move forward.
Well, your modesty definitely precedes you. The one thing that interests me most, I think, about your approach, Greg, is that we, for example, have talked a lot about style on this show, and while not everyone agrees with us, we talk a lot about how style of a fighter, kind of what they do when they have no choice or when they feel uncomfortable, is more determined by personality than by any specific things in their training. And that seems to be the way that you look at fighters as well, that they have certain traits that are going to be there, even if they're making continued efforts to hide them, that are going to be there throughout their career. So how do you identify what are the real weaknesses of an opponent? How do you identify the things that are going to, in your opinion, make them break mentally, whether it's their first or their 50th fight?
Well, sometimes people have done the work for you. Sometimes you'll see them do it consistently on all they lose kind of the same way. And that's super easy.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's, you can just wake up, watch that for 15 minutes, figure it out, and off you go. Sometimes it's much more layered. You have to look for it's just being a watcher, right? You have to look for the subtle differences in their techniques as far as what are they doing at what time. So let's say that people don't like to get hit by a body shot, and that's just for the sake of argument, that's their Achilles heel. So you'll notice that they fight a little bit differently after they take 2 or 3 to the body, and you'll say, oh, that is the path then that we need to take to start that mental breaking process. So sometimes it's very subtle like that, and you'll miss it. You'll miss it 5 times you watch the same tape,
mm-hmm.
and then the 6th time you're like, oh, there it is, what I was looking at those first 5 times. And again, sometimes it's glaringly obvious, but it's what you're really looking for is any kind of subtle change in your opponent's psychology, even over aggressiveness. Some people get hit and they just, they're totally aggressive. And if you can play within that whirlwind and make sure that you don't get as aggressive, but you stay disciplined, you pick your shots, they're going to open themselves up because they get overly aggressive, and you'll be able to kind of pick them apart and take over the initiative and take over the rhythm. So it is it gets, the better the opponent is at hiding that stuff, the more challenging it becomes. And it's a lot of fun. It really is. It's just basically a puzzle, right? You're just looking you're looking at these puzzle pieces and trying to see where you can kind of fit in the gaps to try and exploit their mental weakness.
So two follow-ups on that real quick. One, a more specific one. Have you ever gone into a fight having identified something that you clearly saw as a weakness, as this breaking point, and then had that fight and then had that opponent completely overcome that, like completely fix something that had bedeviled them earlier in their careers? Or is that, or when you see something like that, is it just always going to be there?
No, we've had it where, more importantly, we can't get them there. Because usually it'll be there, and sometimes they fixed it, right? And I don't know how many fights I've done, but it's a lot. So we've had almost every scenario you could imagine. But usually it'll still exist, in my opinion. And everybody breaks. There's no such thing as a person that just doesn't break. Everybody has a point where they've had enough. It's just a matter of time and pressure. But you can't get them there. So in other words, you keep trying to get them to that point, but you just can't. This is where technique really comes in. You can't. Your footwork isn't allowing you to set up the combinations that you need to get to the place that you need to be in order to start them down that path. And that happens a lot. And sometimes you get them there, and indeed that they have fixed it, and you're like, oh, well, that was not going to work. And so that's where, and sometimes that's where cornering is fun, because then you have to try to adjust on the fly. You're like, okay, this game plan isn't going the way I thought it would, and so now we need to make some adjustments. So I like having a kind of a backup plan. At least sometimes in my mind, some fighters don't like backup plan because it seems like, oh, well, then why are we even doing this one? If we, you know what I mean? They get, even subconsciously, they question, well, why is this happening then? Why do I need to worry about this if we're just going to do that? But usually mentally, at least, I have another place where I know, okay, I know this person can go there if I need them to do that.
That's really interesting. So I had one more follow-up, because you talked about fighters who don't necessarily respond well to getting hit. We've been talking a fair bit about this lately, especially because we've been doing so much talking about Ronda Rousey in the lead up to UFC 207 and then afterwards. She always struck me as an interesting case in that regard, that it wasn't that she shied away from getting hit necessarily, but it was that when she got hit, it kind of seemed to drive her game plan out of her head. Like, it was hard for her to continue to stay focused on on what she had brought into the fight. How much do you think something like that is fixable in a fighter?
Well, it is, but we have to look at Ronda, and people are dealing with Ronda at an emotional level, meaning that when she gets hit, like, everybody's got a game plan until they get hit, but it wasn't actually that, in my opinion. What do I know about anything? But it's that she looked for her anchors. She has certain anchors that she goes for, that we were able to identify at the Holly fight. She has certain anchors that she goes for, that when she locks onto those anchors, then she can move. So I think it's much more of getting damaged, but then also being denied access to that anchor. One of her anchors that she does is she reaches around with her left hand and tries to, like, grab you behind the neck. So when she tries for that and it doesn't work, then you're kind of she doesn't have like a second or third thing to do. So she's very hub oriented. Hub meaning that you have a node that gives you X, Y, and Z, but you have to have that hub. You have to get there to get the X, Y, and Z. And when she's denied that, I think that's much more what it's about than she doesn't have a second layer to kind of say, okay, now I need to do this, that, and the other thing. It's kind of like, well, I don't really know where to go now, and I'm getting hit. So I don't think that she's a warrior, and I don't think that, like, getting hit, like, suddenly bamboozles her off her game. Like, oh my goodness, I'm in pain. Like, what is this pain that you speak of? It's unheard of. I don't think that's her mentality, in my opinion. In my opinion, it's that, okay, well, I'm trying for this thing. Okay, that didn't work. Try it again. That didn't work. Try it again. That didn't work. Okay, well, what do I do now? Damn it, man.
You're essentially saying there's not enough depth to her game.
Exactly. So I think that that's an emotional reaction to say, oh, well, she just loses her, she loses her mind when she gets punched in the face. I don't really think that's her, because certainly she's gone toe-to-toe with a lot of people and just basically went into face punching competitions before, and was able to just bomb it basically and get out of there.
Yeah.
I think that once she fixes that layered approach, when she says, okay, here's A, B, and C, this doesn't work, I immediately go to that. That doesn't work, I immediately come back to this. I think that her career will be just fine.
That's a really interesting point, and it makes a lot of sense, because you're right. In the Nunes fight, it wasn't so much when she got hit; it was when she got hit and then reached for a collar tie and Nunes shucked her off. That was when things really started to go downhill. That makes perfect sense. So that brings us around to something we've talked about this a couple of times. The way that you seem to approach game planning is based on that idea of nodes. So you mentioned getting Rousey off of that single collar tie as an example of one kind of node. How do you go about identifying those particular spots in a fighter's game that you want to avoid?
Well, you kind of see what they want to go for, because everybody, when you first start a fight, it depends on the fighter. Some fighters are super nervous when they first start a fight, and they immediately go to what they do. Some can relax and play a little bit, but everybody's got kind of a general idea. Sometimes if it's very specific in the game plan, some fighters are like, I don't even like game plans, bro. I just go out of there and bang, and that's fine too. But they have ideas of what they want to do and where they want to go, and those ideas can be formed, as you get your feedback, as you see, okay, this is happening, that's happening. But you have ideas. So if you see enough tape, that's a really great thing about MMA, is that you have tape. Like, you can predict the future because you can see the past so many times. It is one of those situations where you can just see these tendencies over and over and over again. And tendencies aren't techniques. That's a big misconception. That's not like, well, they hit 75% of their jab, so that doesn't tell me anything. That just tells me that they're good with the jab, which is fine. You can see that in the first 5 minutes of a fight. Tendencies are, where do they use the jab? Why are they using it? Are they setting up something from it? They're avoiding damage with it. You have to ask the whys. Why are they doing that? Why is this person doing this technique at this time? And so if you can answer that, that's usually a good way to kind of ascertain, oh, they're doing this for that. They need to slow down the fight. They're tired here, so they keep putting you against the cage if they want to slow down the fight and get their air back so they can be explosive again, or they want to stop the damage, or whatever it may be. The whys in a fight, why are they doing that, is more important than the whats. What are they doing is not nearly as important. I don't know if that makes sense.
You are absolutely meant for this show, Greg, because we have talked a lot in the past about the difference between tactics and strategy, and I usually say that tactics are all about the how. How do you accomplish a specific goal? And strategy is what knits them together. Strategy asks, why are you trying to accomplish a specific goal? What's the point?
Right. So, right, exactly. And the why, where in the whys are, that's your past to your underlying kind of psychological profile of where they're going to go and what they're going to do in the fight. And there are some people, and you'll notice, like my good people, that I try to, in my freaking very humble, clumsy way, I try to get that out, because again, then you're saying, well, what about your fighter? The utility of your fighter, what do they prefer? And so trying to make them unpredictable and change rhythm and do unexpected things in the middle of all of this, can be very, very effective, because then the whys become, well, why did you just do that? Well, because he just threw off his rhythm. You know what I mean? Like that. Then you get into the arms escalation, I guess, would be the best way to do it, where they do it, you do it, they do it, you do it.
And a lot of that surely must be accomplished in the corner, that being unpredictable, staying on your feet. And you're kind of known as the guy behind the scenes who comes up with some of the best, most consistently effective strategies in the game, but also as the guy who adopts any number of different personalities or approaches in the corner as needed. What is your philosophy on cornering a fighter in the fight, and how does it differ from preparing beforehand?
So preparing beforehand is mostly technical and mental work, meaning that you want to get them mentally strong where they can push through fatigue, push through pain, because those things are trying to pull you out of the process. Mm-hmm. Basically, once you get into the cage, like anything in combat, you're a hunter. You need to be hunting. You're hunting a person down. And so staying in that mentality of hunting and putting yourself in the right place at the right time to do the right things is very important. What pulls you out of that process is pain and fatigue and self-doubt and, whatever it is, fear of judgment. All of these things kind of try to take you and pull you out of it. As soon as somebody hits you and you say, wow, that hurt. Okay, I don't want to get hit there again. as soon as you do that in that kind of context, you're immediately on the defense. Now the other guy has the initiative because you're worried about protecting something instead of saying, he hits you and he's like, oh, nice shot. Okay, now my turn. You know what I mean? Like there's a difference in mentality. So training that into people is very important. Obviously, the technical work has to be there. You need to be able to acquire angles, be it on the ground or on your feet, and do the right techniques, et cetera, et cetera. So that preparation beforehand is mostly that, just plugging in the game plan over and over and over, letting them practice, letting them flow, letting them bond with the techniques that you introduce. And then there's a lot. You have to come up with new moves. You have to keep them interested. You have to come up with things that they don't know yet so that they stay kind of focused and put challenges in front of them. We could do a whole show just on that. And then on the other side of it, it's about being comfortable. You have to, and I mean, you're just talking about this, being comfortable, being uncomfortable is a big deal. Like being able to survive where others falter, thrive where others falter is also a big deal. So part of that is that mentality coming in there that allows you to do that. And then part of it is just assessing psychology, seeing where your opponent is. Some opponents, some people don't do well with positive feedback. They just don't. Like Andrei Arlovsky, for instance. Like you can't say, Andrei, I loved you. You're amazing. Like you can tell him that it's a friend because he's a great guy. But if you're like, Andrei, goddammit, go do this, this, and this. And then he's like, oh, yes, sir, got it. Boom, off he goes. But if you're like, Andrei, if you don't mind going over here and doing these things, he'd be like, come on, guy. Because that's his mentality. But other fighters, you have to be very calm and patient with. I try to make them laugh because when stuff's going crazy, you have to stay focused. But these guys are professionals, so it's not like I'm in there with, an amateur with 4 fights. You know what I mean? That would be a very different situation. I would stay calm, consistent. Here's what you need to do. And there are fighters that need that. A lot of times they just need to take a breath and relax, refocus their mind. And then they need some like, what do you think I should do? They need a little anchor to say, okay, I want to try this, or he's doing that. So usually it's just staying calm, getting them to relax so that they can keep their minds moving. Because the number one thing you don't want to do when you're actually in combat of any kind is have that mind freeze on you where you're like, you can't, there's no forward progress. You're not hunting anymore, right? You're frozen. So shaking you out of that, even if I say something ridiculous, like everybody always brings up the hit him with the groin thing with George St-Pierre, like even whatever it takes to shake them out of where they were and put them where they need to be, that's my job. Like as the coach or whatever you want to call my job, the guide, I prefer guide, but that would be my job, is to keep them moving on the path towards success.
Well, I think that's probably mine and a lot of other people's favorite corner moments ever, so I wouldn't worry about that being ridiculous. The hit him with your groin is an all-time classic in this sport.
Great. I'm glad that's what I'm known for. I hope it's on my tombstone. Greg, hit him with your groin, Jackson.
Well, so that's a really interesting thing there, though, that you can work with diverse personality types, because there are a lot of really great coaches in this sport who tend to drift toward particular approaches, and they stick with those because they work for them. So Rafael Cordero is very big on positive reinforcement. That is his go-to method of motivating his fighters. He told me he doesn't use negative reinforcement because he doesn't think it works for the guys that he's training, So, but the fact that you can kind of switch between those modes is partially what sets you apart. And so when you have such a diversity of different fighters under your roof, how does that affect the training camp process? Because you have some guys like Donald Cerrone who are not big on watching tape, and then you have other guys like John Jones who are absolute tape junkies. How does that affect your role in preparing a fighter?
Well, it just changes it. So, I mean, and that goes for technique too. Everything has to be tailored to the individual fighter. So I guess it would be the difference between if you have like a very select group of people that you need there. This is like an individual sport. It's a group sport. It's a very individual sport as well. That means that you can't train everybody the same. And you'll see that with other teams. And even I'm guilty of it sometimes too, where everybody is, so like you're a great wrestler and you can kickbox or whatever your modality is. As long as you fit those parameters, you're going to excel well. But if you step outside of those parameters, if you don't have a great wrestling base and you know how to kickbox, you're just not going to excel in that environment. So trying to take the fighter's personality, and I don't mean personality like, are they aggressive people or are they friendly people? Because some of the sweetest, nicest people when they fight are the most aggressive I've ever seen. So it's their fighting personality, not their everyday life personality. What they like, how they function, what what they do to enable success is different from everyone. So that's just getting to know your fighter. Like, again, Sun Tzu said, know yourself, know your enemy. And so getting to know your troops is a big deal. Getting to know, like, my first 3 or 4 fights with anybody, it's a learning process for me. I'm like, okay, we did this, that didn't work. We did this, that did work. Our warm up was too long. This was too short. You know what I mean? I'm always trying to pick apart and see what's happened. Pull this piece, pull that piece. This triggered him well. This shut him down. So you're learning the whole time, and then you have to be able to watch your fighter and say, here's what we need to do to shore up the weaknesses. But he's not going to be, some fighters are not going to be doing spinning, jumping back kicks to the head. Others will. So you just have to take the modality that is given to you, and then that's your art. Right now you have to plug in these holes to make sure that the weaknesses are being addressed, but then you also have to give them places to go. Okay, these are where you need to be offensive minded. This is where you need to expand your arsenal a little bit. You keep going to these moves. We need to get out of that. So that kind of stuff is very important too. And then psychology plays in there. Like, when you feel like you're hurt, you need to learn how to push through whatever it is, shoring up the weaknesses technically and psychologically. But that's everybody. So then I take that into an individual cornering approach as well. So I don't really know another way to do it other than just to tailor it to the individual. I would probably, if I was in the military, I'd be really bad at big army where everybody has to do the exact same thing all the time. I think I'd be a much better small unit guy than I would be a big army guy.
Squadron leader. Thank you very much, Greg.
Something where I could get, maybe a little bit more individualized, at least with the squad. But I probably wouldn't be very good at that job. I have a lot of friends that do it, and they're way smarter than I am.
Well, you've got quite an impressive squad over there at Jackson Wink, and your reputation precedes you. We could probably carry on, if you had the time, this conversation for hours and hours and hours, because all this is extremely fascinating. But hopefully we can continue at another time, and thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Anytime you guys want me on. You ask smart questions, so anytime you want me on, I'm there.
I will ask you questions for a 24-hour period straight. You would regret it afterwards if you gave me carte blanche.
Don't threaten me with a good time.
Thank you very much, Greg. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Greg.
No problem. We'll talk to you guys soon. Be safe.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. Hello and welcome back to Heavy Hands. I apologize. I don't know if this will be the case for the Greg Jackson episode that kicked off this episode, but I'm a little under the weather, as you may be able to tell from my voice, so my apologies for that. I know I've brought this up in the past, but it's like when Barney Rubble's voice changed on the Flintstones and it ruined my childhood, so I know it's not a fun experience to suddenly hear a different voice on a familiar program. But we do have some fights to talk about, and so through rain, sleet, snow, or what is apparently a head cold, the show must go on. I'm Connor Ruebusch, of course. Patrick Wyman is here with me, and we're mostly going to be talking from a few different perspectives about the interesting outcomes of UFC Phoenix, which, by the way, was a solid event. Pretty enjoyable to watch live. Didn't have a lot of potential. I believe Pat, you and I may have called it, on paper, one of the worst cards the UFC's ever put out, but as is often the case, it didn't play out that way. It was pretty good.
Well, you can have a well-matched bad card or a poorly matched bad card.
Yeah.
And this was a well-matched bad card. These were fights that did not feature high-level talent, but which were put together in such a way that violence was the most likely outcome, and violence is exactly what we got, especially on the undercard, like Bojan Mihailovic versus Joachim Christensen. Neither one of those guys, quite frankly, really needs to be in the UFC.
Sure.
But if you put them against each other, the outcome was absolutely going to be one dude knocking the other out.
Right.
So, or Cyril Asker versus
Dmitry
one of the Dmitries.
Smolyakov.
Was it Smolyakov? Okay,
Yeah.
Dmitry Smolyakov, the quintessential Russian heavyweight body type.
One of the Dmitries. Yeah, definitely.
But like absolutely somebody was going to get knocked out in that fight too, and that's exactly what happened. Like there are better and worse ways to match up like scraping the bottom of the barrel fighters in these divisions, and this was the right way to do it. So because I think this is one of the first cards that Mick Maynard has had his hand in matching. He was at the event, so I would think that, you know, if this is the kind of matchmaking we're going to get from him and Shelby moving forward, I'm pretty okay with it. But actually, I mean, we were planning on just talking about Yair Rodriguez first, but do you want to talk about matchups? Because that was something you wanted to talk about.
Yeah,
today,
I think
Connor.
it's
segue into that.
Yeah, why not? We'll frame our discussion through that, because I think it's a lens through which it's very interesting to look at this card. We have a lot of different ways that fighters were matched on this card, ways that some of these fighters have been matched in the past, and we can maybe talk today not just about how they looked in these performances, but why their performances are affected, why and how they are affected by the fights they are given. As they, you know, as these fighters try to sort of build momentum and build their careers, it really has an impact who they're given as an opponent.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it also helps us as observers of the sport to understand why the UFC puts the matchups together that it does, because there is a rhyme and reason to it. Like there are matchups that can and should be criticized, but a card like this offers us a really nice window into their thought process, into their thinking. Like, so to return to the examples of those low level fights I just talked about, like those were fights where one guy was supposed to get finished in entertaining fashion and the loser was going to get cut. Like that was very clearly the intended outcome of those. They were filler on a card that wasn't going to generate a whole lot of interest, especially on the undercard portion of it. So what you're hoping for is entertainment and a clear winner and a clear loser, so you can kind of trim the fat.
Let's put it this way: the first 4 fights. By the way, the Fight Pass prelims may have been the best thing about this card all the way through.
Yeah.
In terms
they were fantastically fun.
In terms of just watching value, the first 4 fights, all 8 fighters featured lost in their last bout. So basically, it's a sort of sorting out who doesn't belong here kind of setup in every one of those first 4 fights.
Yes, which comes in a broader context in which the UFC is trying to trim the roster. By the way, like this is an important thing to remember, maybe a little bit outside our normal topics of conversation, but like as a fan, if you want to understand the action inside the cage, sometimes you need to understand the action outside of it too. And in the broad context right now, the UFC is planning on running fewer events this year, fewer cards. There are going to be probably fewer slots on those cards. I think they want to shorten them up a little bit. And so to do that, you cannot have as many fighters under contract as they have right now. They have more than 500 fighters under contract. There are simply not enough fight slots to go around. So you're probably going to see a lot of cuts. We have already seen quite a few cuts, not a ton of additions. When they add fighters for the next couple of months, it's either going to be extremely late notice replacements when they absolutely cannot find anybody else on the roster, or really, really big time talents like Tom Duquesnoy, who they just signed.
Sure, yeah, people who need to be signed. Well, let's go away from those Fight Pass guys. I do want to come back to them later and talk about the matchmaking in their matchups. But let's just go ahead and kick things off officially with Yair Rodriguez. Of course, the man that everyone came to see, except for those who left very sad after seeing what he did to BJ Penn. But I think the realistic among us expected Yair Rodriguez to win this fight. Why was he given BJ Penn, in your estimation? Was it a good matchup? And what did we learn from it?
Well, he was given BJ Penn because in combat sports, the young eat the old. Sure, that's the nature of the business.
Although I do have to say, BJ at this point is hardly like he's hardly the Oscar De La Hoya to Yair's Manny Pacquiao or Floyd Mayweather. No, absolutely,
or Floyd Mayweather for that matter.
It's certainly a few steps down the torch passing ladder.
Yes, but BJ was okay. Yeah, let me take a step back here. The way that in combat sports more generally, the way this is supposed to work is one guy's name value passes to the next, and that's how you maintain interest across generations of fighters. Yeah. That's what makes it. That's what will make it awful if Mayweather does in fact stay retired, never loses to anybody. All the name value of all the guys that he beat kind of dies with him,
or
dies with his career.
Yeah, if Pacquiao does not give that fight to Terrence Crawford or someone like that, you never gain all the momentum that Pacquiao has, going all the way back to the first times that he fought guys with known names.
Exactly. And so it all leads back in kind of a long unbroken chain hopefully a really long way back, because it's hard for anybody to build up their own name value, their own momentum without taking a little bit of somebody else's.
It's like the law of conservation of hype, basically.
Exactly. That is the perfect way of putting it. I think that should enter the heavy hands canon.
Sure, why not?
Right there.
Hype can neither be created nor destroyed, or at least it's very difficult to do so, but it can be passed from one fighter to another.
Precisely. So, and the UFC has been pretty open about this over the years. When they're asked about, a star retiring or losing a star, they're like, well, you just make the next one. But the way that you make the next one is by the next one beating the old one.
Right.
Like Rashad beat Chuck, Machida beat Rashad, and so on and so forth down the line up to John Jones.
And the guys who have tons of momentum or who really stand out are the ones who beat lots of those guys.
Exactly.
GSP beats a Matt Hughes. He gets a big story coming back to beat Sarah. Anderson has, the Belfort fight. You got to have all of these things where somebody who has a lot of name value, and then you get 3 or 4 guys in a row with a lot of name value. That is how you get a superstar. Typically, I will say both Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey are a little bit of an exception to that rule, but we could talk about that another time.
Yeah, that's what makes them really interesting as phenomena within the sport of MMA is the extent to which their hype has been a self-sustaining process, largely driven by the way the UFC has been able to place them.
Right.
But you can see, given what's happened with Van Zandt and Northcutt, the limits of doing that. Like, there are limits to the extent to which, for a broader audience, you can create a star. But leaving that aside, so with Yair Rodriguez, this was like, okay, we need a name guy to give him. There aren't that many name guys in the featherweight division. We need something to get him across to a broad audience of hopefully semi-casual fans. It's either Frankie Edgar or that's it. That's literally the only other guy in that division who has something like a name that you could give Yair Rodriguez.
True.
Or it's either Edgar or Aldo, or McGregor, and those aren't like the Edgar fight. Even if Edgar would take it, which I'm not sure he would, because I'm not sure it makes sense for him to take it.
It doesn't really. But if you're looking for someone between those other options, people who have some kind of name value in the division, and you're looking at it from a perspective of how can we continue to give Yair Rodriguez time to improve and continue to let him win, then obviously BJ Penn is the logical choice.
Yeah, exactly. Because, and you're right about giving him time too. That's a really important point to take away from this is it's not so much about the fight itself. It's about Yair being in camp for 8, 10, or 12 weeks and working on the things that he needs to work on.
Right.
Because I think Sean Shelby, when he first got his hands on Yair Rodriguez as a talent, when he was fighting Leonardo Morales for the first Tough Latin America title a little over 2 years ago now, I think he realized that what he had on his hands was a really raw but really talented guy, right? And the kind of guy who could be a star. He's a good-looking guy in a market that they want to get into, big time in Mexico, and a market that they've invested a lot of time and money in. But it doesn't do you any good if you've got your big-time hot prospect on whom you want to pin a lot of promotional hopes if you don't give that guy time to turn into the guy that you want him to be. So They have taken their time with him. They've been really nice and slow. This was his 6th fight, and BJ Penn was the guy with the most name value that he's fought. Before this, he fought Alex Caceres, who was a stylistically favorable opponent. These have all been fights designed to give Yair Rodriguez the time to turn into the fighter they want him to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've critiqued the UFC a lot in the past for their matchmaking, and sometimes it is very suspect, and we will talk about that more as the show goes on. But maybe they really do understand the limitations of what, looking at the fighters as commodities. Maybe they actually tend to have a good grasp of what those fighters' potential really is. And with somebody like Sage Northcutt or Paige Van Zandt, it seems logical that perhaps the UFC matchmakers realize that their appeal sort of exists regardless of whether or not they win, because they are sort of that manufactured hype in a way. And they also realize that they now have at least a modicum of name value that can be passed on to fighters with more actual potential. And that guys like Yair Rodriguez have that actual potential and so shouldn't be matched recklessly the way guys like Northcutt and Van Zandt sometimes are. With Rodriguez, and we'll see this too with Sergio Pettis a little further down, both fighters who I think have a lot of potential in their divisions, yeah, they have been matched remarkably carefully. They have, it's not been all. It's really not been any easy fights for Yair Rodriguez until arguably this one. But that's kind of the idea, is that he's been given slight steps up in competition or slightly different kinds of tests, and all with the end goal of basically giving him enough time he's learning on the job. You got to give him enough time to make those adjustments from one fight to the next, enough time spent in camps, as you said, enough time and enough leeway against a certain level of opposition to feel creative and have fun and expand sort of organically. And maybe a fight with BJ Penn is the perfect culmination of that, because it's probably the guy with the most name value outside of, for the casual fans, probably the guy whose name is the most recognizable that Yair has fought, but also arguably the easiest one he's had in the UFC yet.
Yeah, compare the way that they have matched Yair Rodriguez with how they've matched Mirsad Bektic.
Sure.
In his first few fights in the UFC. Bektic has not been given a single on paper easy matchup, or even favorable matchups. I think he got a brutal stylistic matchup in Chaz Skelly in his UFC debut, a really durable, rugged.
Well, that's classic UFC matchmaking too. You take two promising prospects and just smash them together in their debuts.
Exactly, and Bektic managed to kind of scrape through that with a good deal of luck.
Yeah.
But then every opponent he's gotten from there on out has been somebody who could have beaten him under the right circumstances. Except he ended up fighting Paul Redmond, but he was scheduled to fight somebody much more imposing in his second UFC fight. I'm gonna go back and check this out, and see who he was scheduled to fight.
Yeah. It's definitely it's hard to glean from the outside what the overall philosophy of matchmaking is in the UFC, but it's refreshing to see it done well. And I think, I spent a good portion of time talking to you, Pat, before we started recording here, complaining about the state of boxing nowadays and how I would, as a boxing fan, I would like it to be much better and have more consistently exciting fights. In part, that's because fighters are not matched well. They are matched too protectively. And I don't want to see that happen in the UFC, where prospects are protected and coddled until they get a big cash out, and whether they win or lose, it doesn't matter because the investment pays off in the end. I want to see them matched well and turn into the best versions of themselves by being tested. But it's a narrow line to walk.
So here were the guys that Bektic has been matched up with since entering the UFC, or was scheduled to face. He was scheduled to face he fought Chaz Skelly. Then he was scheduled to face Ernest Chavez, who was about the right kind of matchup for a promising prospect in his second fight. But Chavez pulled out of that fight with an injury and was scheduled to be replaced by Max Holloway.
Right.
Then Bektic was scheduled to face Alan Omer, who's another really talented prospect and a guy who was would have been a tough stylistic matchup for Bektic at that point. Then he was scheduled to face Renato Moicano, another super tough, talented young prospect. He was replaced by Lucas Martins, whom Bektic just ran over like a freight train. Then Bektic was scheduled to face Tatsuya Kawajiri,
super experienced veteran.
Yeah. Then Arnold Allen,
a fellow hot prospect.
Yeah, that is much more standard UFC matchmaking.
Yeah, it's just kind of random. It doesn't really seem to have a philosophy at play behind it.
Well, I mean, I think the philosophy is let's put him in exciting and difficult matchups and see if he comes through all right.
I guess it's trial by fire.
Yeah, because I think if you're Sean Shelby and you're looking at Bektic, you're like, okay, this dude is a monster talent. Let's throw him into the fire and see if he's the kind of phenom who's going to win a title in his 10th fight. Which is one way for them that is one way that they matchmake. And if he had lost one of those fights, I'm sure they would have taken a step back and kind of built him a little more slowly.
Probably.
But
it does strike me as sort of a Whiplash approach. It's like J.K. Simmons in Whiplash, right? You may get the most genius one as champion, one out of every 1,000 prospects. But you're going to kill about 99 out of 100 geniuses that you get, because not every genius is genius enough to survive a trial by fire like that. There are some that need a little bit of cultivating, and they will still be just as genius as the one who survives.
Well, but that's kind of the point, right? Is that the UFC does not generally see itself as being in the cultivating
Yeah,
business.
they're making
Like,
it the easiest method to get the most dominant fighters possible.
exactly. Yeah, because you want to control the cream of the cream of the cream of the cream. And if you're the UFC, you understand that basically everybody else is to some extent expendable. The
Yeah.
only fighters who aren't expendable are the best ones on the very face of the planet. Um, like now we could have kind of a deeper discussion about the extent to which the UFC needs kind of upper mid-tier guys who can headline fight night cards and fill the like 3 of the 5 slots on a pay-per-view. But at the end of the day, people buy pay-per-views for the name value at the top, and this is the method that is going to get you the most dominant names at the very, very top.
True. Although a lot of those names who can fill out a pay-per-view are also the kinds of names that give real narrative heft to your superstars fights. You know, it's good to have somebody with that kind of value. I don't know, if Conor McGregor is defending his lightweight title, it's good to have some narrative pull with guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov and Tony Ferguson. They're not just, at that point, they're in the right division and in the right place in their careers, that they're not just main card filler, you know, for a pay-per-view. They add to the value of a McGregor fight in some small way.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's not really their philosophy. Like,
Yeah.
we could, I mean, I think if you and I were matchmaking, that might be the way that you and I would approach it. But that is not the way the UFC generally has or does. Like, in addition, because to some extent, their goal is not just to produce the best fights, it's also to keep costs down. And if you have a whole raft of guys that you're trying to develop, then you're kind of making the kinds of choices that leads to those guys having more leverage in contract negotiations.
True.
Because
Yeah.
they know they're wanted.
Very true. That's a good point.
So
It's
yeah, I mean,
it's an interesting juggling act, the promotion of fighters, but we do have some other ones that are worth talking about here. Why don't we take a quick break, and when we come back, we will talk a little more about Yair Rodriguez, but also about Sergio Pettis, about Devin Powell, yet another looking for a fight prospect who was wiped out in his UFC debut. We'll talk about Augusto Mendez, talented if not entirely young fighter, and we may talk as well about Walt Harris and a few others in this card. We have a lot of good examples of how matchmaking affects the outcome of a matchup and the momentum of a fighter's career path. We'll talk more about that soon. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And welcome back. So let's finish talking about Yair Rodriguez's game. Matchmaking has had an effect on how he's developed as a fighter. Pat, before we began today, you were talking about seeing him make specific improvements from one fight to the next, addressing the things that seem like the weakest points in each past fight, addressing that by the time he has his next one.
Yeah, and I think the big shift that was noticeable to me in this one was how much better his footwork looked in tight spaces. He did a much better job of moving. He did a much better job of staying off the fence than he has in the past. And he showed a lot more kind of in tight spaces, quick, tight technical footwork. That was because it was noticeable in the Caceres fight that when he was really, really pressured, his footwork fell apart just a little bit.
Yeah.
And only in stretches, but it was clear that it was a thing that he had worked on that wasn't quite there yet.
Yeah, and BJ wasn't necessarily pressuring him as effectively as Caceres did in portions of their fight, but Rodriguez was still, I think, executing techniques that, had he been matched with Caceres again, they were techniques that clearly were born of his experience in that bout. Taking quick little, I noticed too that, as you said, the quick little steps inside, little side steps, little stance changes, Dillashaw-esque stuff in close, even when it wasn't entirely necessary with a fairly plodding 38-year-old BJ Penn in front of you. It was nice to see Rodriguez exercising the opportunity to show off his improvements.
Yeah, that's true. this was the right opponent for him to test some of that stuff out, because BJ, like, look, BJ did not look good. I want to be as clear as possible about that. But BJ did enter the fight with the right game plan. And had Rodriguez not looked as outstanding as he did, BJ could have done some things to give him some trouble.
He stole a few moments, too. He did kind of what you would, the best you could hope for from a really old, very shop-worn fighter. He stole a few moments, landed a really good right hand, landed some good counter jabs early. He was trying. You know, he looked like he had prepared. And so if Rodriguez had come in and just decided to fuck around, it could have fallen apart.
Yeah, I mean, I still think Rodriguez's talent would have probably found a way to pull him out of that, but like, it could have been a lot tougher than it turned out to be. As it turned out, it was a snuff film.
Yeah, pretty much.
Like, I can't take credit for that particular description, at least at least for me. A good friend of mine and friend of the show, Teddy Reyes, a guy I used to train with, wonderful dude, posted it in our like shared like MMA related group called Hell Yeah Violence with the caption snuff film. So so props to Teddy. If you're listening, that was I stole that directly from you
for correctly and humorously identifying the death of a great man. Well done, Teddy. You nailed it.
Yeah, exactly. So that was one thing that was really striking to me. I still think he's not super comfortable in the mid-range, and where you see that, what he still needs to work on, I think, are adjustment steps. So he knows how to keep his feet under him when he's throwing a blitzing punching combination, and he knows how to plant his feet and throw. What he doesn't do a particularly good job of is when he's in that kind of mid-range of keeping his feet under him as he adjusts. Either he plants or he kind of takes big steps forward. So what he needs to learn to do is take small steps as he's throwing to keep him on his opponent, or to keep him out of range as he tries to counterpunch as he backsteps.
And that's kind of typical with a naturally athletic, really dynamic fighter, is to have an easy grasp on the big things. The dynamic fighter can, like Rodriguez, can leap and cover distance with these big steps really easily. But when it comes to playing a game of inches, that's more of an intellectual way of looking at fighting, and it's not a natural athleticism kind of thing.
It's also just harder to learn. You know, like, it's easy to learn to throw a blitzing combination, and it's easy to learn to plant your feet. Adjustment steps, which to me are really characteristic of the Dutch style of kickboxing. I think because you spend so much time in that middle range, you need to learn to make small adjustments. Like, those are hard to learn. You have to spend a lot of time doing nothing but marching back and forth across a mat, making sure that you're stepping with the right foot as you're punching. You know, like, I literally did the first few Dutch style classes I did. We literally spent an hour or an hour and a half doing nothing but punching and moving at the same time, and not big steps, but small, slight adjustment steps. And like, it's mind numbing. It's not especially fun, but now I know how to do it, and like, it makes you better for it.
It is strange.
It takes just tons of practice.
It is strange to think of being the type of person, because I'm so clearly not, who can easily grasp the distance management and everything behind a double tap jumping double head kick, but cannot quite get the mechanics of a stepping jab. But that is the case with a lot of fighters like Rodriguez, who you can kind of see at their first gym or whatever, they excelled because they just got it. They were basically allowed to do their own thing. So it is heartening to see Rodriguez's corner make concerted efforts now, and probably Rodriguez himself deserves some credit for this as well, make concerted efforts to improve the little subtle things so that he won't someday be in Anthony Pettis' shoes, not having learned all the fundamentals that he'll need to back up this crazy dynamic ability that he has.
That's a really good point, because Rodriguez to me has always seemed like a mixture of Anthony Pettis and Max Holloway, right? And those are two different developmental paths, and we saw the ways in which those developmental paths could split off when Holloway and Pettis fought each other, right? Two extremely talented guys, extremely dynamic guys, who could have turned out a lot differently than they ended up. Like, you can see a world in which Max Holloway never goes and actually gets a striking coach, because Holloway was a mostly self-taught striker until the McGregor fight, which is mind-blowing. You can see a world in which Holloway never goes and gets another striking coach, and he turns out to be a pretty dang good fighter still, but he never reaches the level that he's at now, where he can do practically everything with equal amounts of skill. He is as close to a jack of all trades as a striker as you can get. You can conversely see a point where Anthony Pettis goes to work with somebody who is not Duke Rufus, who tears down his fundamentals and rebuilds him, where he still has the dynamic ability to finish fights, but has much cleaner fundamentals of the kind that are going to serve him well as he ages.
Yeah.
Now, Rodriguez seems to be getting kind of the best of both worlds, where he's still got the dynamism and he's becoming even more of a finisher. Like, did you notice how much meaner he seemed against BJ?
Yeah, definitely.
Like, so where he's got that, but he also now is getting much better fundamentals and the kind of meat and potatoes stuff you need to fill in the gaps between your big, impressive, dynamic movements.
For sure, yeah. Well, speaking of Duke Rufus, we've talked before about the many and some of them confusing reasons behind Anthony Pettis's weird late career stall out. We've talked about the fall of Pettis the Elder, but this Sunday, we got to witness part of the rise of Pettis the Younger. Sergio Pettis basically got stuck, I think, with a lot of fans into Ryan Bader territory after his first 2 UFC losses, both memorable finishes, one to Alex Caceres, the other to Ryan Benoit. And a lot of times when that happens with an up-and-comer, fans sort of write that person off. They think, okay, well, they lose badly. I remember their losses very clearly. They were in high-profile fights or whatever the case may be. And so they're no longer a prospect in my mind. But with smart matchmaking and with some really good training, Sergio Pettis, I think, has now come along to the point where he should be considered a contender. Not exactly one at the top of the pile, but he should be considered a contender. Let's talk about the matchmaking in his fight with John Moraga, why they made that fight, why I think it was a very well-matched fight. I think it was the right thing to do with Sergio at this time, but also why he's developing differently than his brother is at this point.
Yeah, all interesting questions to ask. I mean, this was a perfect matchup. Connor, you talked about how much you liked the matchmaking here. I think it's exactly the right fight for Sergio Pettis at this point, because Moraga is a guy who's kind of on the fringes of the top 10. He's got a name. People know who John Moraga is. People have seen John Moraga fight before. They have some level of awareness as to his abilities. He's also the kind of guy that a sloppy or less developed Sergio Pettis, a guy who could maybe had some trouble staying focused, that's a guy that John Moraga would beat. Yeah. And beat in impressive fashion, too.
He is just dangerous enough, and specifically dangerous to the specific weaknesses that Pettis has shown in the past. So it's a great watermark, basically. It's a litmus test to see, have you solved the specific things that you struggled with in earlier fights?
Precisely. Yeah. So that was what Moraga brought to the table. That's why this was good matchmaking. So now, with a clear and pretty impressive win, I think, over Moraga, now Pettis is at the fringes of the flyweight top 10. He's got a 3-fight winning streak going. He can still get better. He still has room to get better, but I think we're now seeing a prime Sergio. He's 23, so he's still young, but this is probably what we can expect from him moving forward. Most of what we'll see from here on out is probably going to be sharpening rather than adding whole new tool sets.
He's been at it for about 6.5 years now, so yeah, it'll probably be a stage of refinement. What refinements did you see in this fight, if any, and what refinements would you like to see? What do you think he still needs to do before he, has a good chance of maintaining that top 10 position?
I thought I saw better combination flow from him, a better sense for picking and choosing his shots, a better sense for mixing up his timing and his rhythm. Mm-hmm. Exactly the kind of tools that you would expect from a lifelong striker who's now entering his physical and skill prime, right?
Yeah, surprisingly willing to mix it up too.
Yeah, which I would actually kind of think of as a bit of a weakness for him. Because if that's the good side of it, the weakness is he does not have the defensive skills, or specifically the layered defense necessary to play an exchanging game with anything more than a light puncher.
Yeah. He looks like Sergio looks like someone who took better note of the things he was taught, but he definitely looks like someone who was trained by the same guy who trained his brother. Anthony too can slip, can pivot, can parry, but these are usually like single responses. They're meant to slip and then throw a counter. Neither is really has the tools necessary to execute a long series of defensive movements without a pretty good chance of being caught. Sergio definitely better than Anthony, but I'm not sure that. I think it does seem that maybe defense is perhaps a weak point of Duke Rufus's.
Yeah, because you can see that Sergio has a sense for the triggers.
Yeah.
Like he knows that when he's supposed to throw a counter. And I think this is kind of a weakness of the whole style of kickboxing that Duke Roufus learned back in the day. There just was not a ton of emphasis on slick defense in that kind of kickboxing in the 90s.
Yeah.
Just wasn't a thing that you were really worried about. And I get the sense from watching training sessions with the boxing coach there, Scott Cushman, who I think is a pretty good teacher of offensive boxing. I think they have good fundamentals. I think they throw clean, hard punches. I think they're pretty efficient with the way that they throw. I think he's good at teaching triggers on counters. I think those are all things that they do pretty well.
Yeah.
But nobody from that gym has anything like what I would call even slightly above average defense.
Yeah.
And Anthony makes up for that by being really tough, though I think now we're seeing kind of the limits of his toughness. But Sergio, who is not an especially durable guy, you cannot be so willing to exchange if you're not either A, super tough, or B, really defensively skilled and defensively sound. He needs to go and work with somebody who is going to fix that.
And he's not a particularly long flyweight, and so he has a lot of bouts in which to land his punches, he kind of has to be there right on the end of punching range with his opponent. Where he really is, I think, best from an outside fighting to land his long range shots, he frequently has to step into the range of his opponent. And so, yeah, that's definitely a problem for Sergio going forward. But I think the UFC is right to treat him, at least this is my take, that they're treating him as someone with actual potential. That he may not be a championship caliber fighter, and really who is, with Demetrius Johnson right now at the top of the division, who is really stands a solid chance of taking that title, I don't know. But he's certainly the kind of fighter who can at least be a really solid measuring stick himself for other contenders, can be in there in some number one contenders matches and give a good fight, especially to someone who is not a striking specialist. I can imagine Sergio Pettis giving a good fight to someone like a Wilson Hayes or someone like that, who maybe also has a few striking gaps of his own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's always going to be kind of a ceiling on how good Pettis can be if he doesn't fix some of those defensive issues. And just because when he gets hit, he seems to get hit real clean, you know?
Mm-hmm.
That's and some of those skills are going to come in time. I think striking defense in MMA with a few very notable exceptions is always going to come way, way, way behind the offense. We've talked about this a little bit before. I'm not really sure why that is, but even guys who have turned into defensive masterminds, like the greatest defensive strikers in MMA history, did not start out as great defensive strikers. You watch Aldo's early fights, and I think Aldo, by consensus, pretty much the best defensive fighter of all time in high level MMA. Aldo got lit up by Shoji Maruyama.
Yeah.
Aldo got hit by by Jonathan Brookins. He got hit a bunch by Jonathan Brookins. Look
at Anderson Silva's early fights.
Yeah, Anderson got hit all the time in those fights. It's shocking when you go back and watch the early fights and see how undeveloped they were defensively.
Right.
So that's not to say that Sergio Pettis can't or won't get better defensively, but it probably needs to be a point of concerted effort for him.
He's already very clearly better suited to it than his brother. Just from temperament alone, I think he puts his strikes together more. His footwork is definitely more consistently effective part of his game than it is
much
Anthony's.
tighter, much cleaner.
Definitely, and I think it's just his willingness to use it. That is a part of his game that has visible layers that make it effective. But when it comes to the other layers of defense that you need when you are in range already, that needs a little work. And Zane Simon, I think, had a good point on the bloody elbow vivisection last week. He identified Sergio's tendency to get hit really cleanly when he gets hit as maybe a product of him admiring his work a little too much.
He does. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Fighting maybe like you would expect someone to fight who is sort of a focus mid hero who's really good on the pads, and their technique is really crisp, and it obviously is for Sergio, but maybe has not put in-fight experience to use in the right way, or hasn't been trained the right way to not take a picture every time you land a good shot, and to know that the fight keeps going and you have to execute a defensive move or another strike of some kind immediately after every successful connection. And Sergio doesn't always do that. Yeah.
That's a really good point. So kind of moving down the card a little bit, you wanted to talk about Frankie Saenz versus Augusto Mendez. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, we had differing opinions going into this one. You thought it was a good matchup for Augusto Mendez. I thought it was foolish, personally, and I still kind of feel like it was foolish. I don't know what the idea is with Augusto Mendez for the UFC. Obviously, he's not a traditional prospect. He's already 32 years old, but he is an absolutely world-class submission grappler, both in the gi and no gi, and also a phenomenal athlete with real power and a very aggressive, willing fighter. So someone who I think is in a position where if I had him on my roster, I'd say he doesn't need much time to develop. He has potential. All we got to do is basically give him the right place to start. And for Augusto Mendez, his starting place was Cody Garbrandt, who is, even then we didn't know Garbrandt was about to be the champion, but we knew he was very dangerous for an inexperienced striker. And then second fight is against a really tough, gritty vet with some power in his hands, and Frankie Saenz. I thought that was going to seal Augusto Mendez's fate as, being ruined by the UFC or not fit for the UFC. It turns out he put in a really convincing performance.
Yeah, I mean, I thought going into this fight, I picked Mendez in this fight, though it was obviously a close matchup. I picked him because I thought he is 33 already. He trains with a high-level camp. He's been off for 11 months. He showed well against Garbrandt early. Like, there were obviously issues, but he had some success. He rocked Garbrandt with a punch. That was a good, clean, hard punch. He had showed a lot more than you would expect from a guy with that little experience in his first 5 MMA fights.
Yeah.
And I would guess that what the UFC saw in looking at him, because he's not 32, he's 33.
Yeah.
So he's even older than that. I would guess if you're the UFC, you're thinking, well, it's either now or never with him. Like, let's throw him in and see what comes out.
Sure, yeah. Maybe that is the case.
Yeah, because this isn't a guy who has, like, he's not Yair Rodriguez. He's not, 23 or 24 or whatever. Like, this is a dude whose time frame is going to be real limited. So if you want to get anything out of him as a product of your promotion, it's either now or never. Either he's going to be ready now or he's not going to be ready at all. So toss him in there and see what happens. And I thought, given all those variables, that he would show enough improvements to beat Saenz. I didn't think it would be this exciting, but I thought that he would get some stuff figured out and make it work.
He's maybe in the Dan Kelly position right now, where he's still, he's probably too old at this point to ever contend, but he does seem to have a natural knack for MMA, for somebody who's a lifelong grappler. So it was good to see. I was very encouraged by that. But lastly, I want to talk a little bit about one of those Fight Pass prelims. I want to talk about Walt Harris, whose name would probably never have come up on this show if he had reacted to his first few UFC bookings the way most fighters do. Because Walt Harris came into the UFC, he came in at 6-1, instantly got Jared Rosholt. So right there, Jared Rosholt, not an exciting fighter, but a very difficult one for a young striker to face. He got smothered en route to a decision, no surprise. Then he gets insta-knocked out by Nikita Krylov and insta-cut from the UFC. One win outside the UFC, he's back in, knocked out by Soa Palele. So first three UFC performances all end in either extremely one-sided or extremely devastating fashion, or both. And yet, Walt Harris is now 2-1 in his last three, with the one being an arguable win in a split decision against Shamil Abdurakhimov. I think it is impossible not to look at Walt Harris and be impressed with how well he has put some pretty negative experience to use, because to me, he looks like a totally different fighter in terms of composure and mental fortitude to the one who was getting easily knocked out and easily controlled in his early bouts.
Yeah, I mean, he's a reminder that for a lot of guys, it just takes some time.
Yeah.
It takes some time and being in the right environment to put things together. Like, not everybody is on the phenom track. And when we talked about this a little earlier, as far as the UFC's matchmaking is concerned, but they're trying to find those phenoms. Guys like Walt Harris, who maybe need a little more time to put everything together, but then can become a really solid piece for them, very rarely get that long a leash. You know, because the UFC is just not in the business of developing good mid-card fighters.
Right.
It doesn't see that as being its job here. Like, that's not what they're trying to promote. Guys like that are filler for these kinds of cards. And maybe they find a following of their own and maybe they don't, but they're not in the business of propping those guys up. So it's nice to see a guy like Walt Harris get himself turned around and kind of build that career for him, because he's a guy who could have a nice productive career as like a mid-tier UFC heavyweight. That's not a bad gig to have.
Well, I mean, athletically, he certainly is on the phenom track. I just think that with the amount of experience he has, he was not mentally ready for that jump up in competition. Coming into the UFC, just wasn't prepared. I think for me the biggest, it's a night and day difference with Harris, where I watch his fight with, I don't know, Soa Palele, and see how tentative he looked, how worried he looked about getting hit, and how it actually made it worse when he did get hit because he was flinching and just a bundle of nerves. And then the fight with Cody East, step in the right direction, looked very calm and collected against Shamil Abdurakhimov, and now he's in here against Chase Sherman, a guy whose toughness alone would probably break the will of a lot of lesser fighters, or might have broken the will of Walt Harris in his first fight. If he went in there and hit a guy like Chase Sherman with everything he had and couldn't put him away, that might have broken the Walt Harris of 2013. But the Walt Harris of early 2017 just kept picking his shots and mixing things up, switching between forcing Sherman to chase and then coming after him with aggressive bursts. And I mean, I thought it was a really classy performance, which is not what I expected from Walt Harris even just a year ago. I did not expect classy game performances.
Yeah, that's true. It's always nice to see something like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that about does it. We had our Greg Jackson interview earlier on this episode, and I know it was fantastic. So thank you all for listening to that and for listening to us talk matchmaking. A little bit of a change of pace from our usual subjects, but I think it is interesting to look at fighter development and how you basically build a prospect and then ultimately even a superstar. So thank you for joining us for this discussion today. If you would like to have some questions answered on the air, and you are one of our $5 patrons or one of our $20 patrons who get your segment topic suggestions, send those to us over on our Patreon. Send us a message, that's the best way, or put a comment on the Patreon post that's up there. We will probably be doing some questions next week, and we are in need of new ones. So all of you people who have had questions answered in the last few months, send us all the stuff that you got. We want to talk to you guys and hear what you want us to talk about. And if you want to get at us on social media, you can do that. Twitter is probably the best way. I am at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. And otherwise, I think that's about it for us. Pat, anything else to say before we get out?
Yeah, I got a few things going on right now.
Sure.
New episode of Fall of Rome came out last week on the late Roman army and how it had changed from the early Roman army and how it fit into society more broadly. The new podcast, History Matters, that I'm doing with a good friend of mine, Keith Plymers, is out. The first episode is out. We're doing a second episode this week. We're talking about political breakdown and crisis in kind of broad historical perspective.
And that is basically a show which is kind of about not repeating the mistakes of the past, right? Using historical perspective to frame current issues.
Yeah, I mean, just looking in deep perspective. Like, all of these issues and problems have a history. Things you can't put yourself in. It's not like plugging variables into an equation where we look at the past and we're like, okay, given inputs X and Y, we get result Z. But these are ways of thinking about and grasping our current historical moment.
It's the kind of stuff that I always said was the reason I studied history, because it sounds good, but really I just liked Knights in Armor.
Yeah, well, that's also totally fair. I mean, but basically, it's the world that we live in is not the only possible outcome.
Right.
That different circumstances can lead to different outcomes, and understanding the different ways in which things can work out is important for understanding the consequences of our own time and place.
It's a strictly anti-teleological show.
Yes, very much so. Keith and I both hate teleology. We're also both structuralists, so take that as you will.
All right.
But I'm not really writing very much this week. I'm doing a top 25 prospect list with my colleague Scott Harris, looking at the top MMA prospects of 2017. And then I'm working on a thing on the new Legacy Fighting Alliance, the product of Legacy Fighting Championship and RFA, Resurrection Fighting Alliance, their merger. They're trying to run something like 30 shows this year on Access TV. So I'm really interested. I got a bunch of interviews. We'll learn more about that.
Wow, very interesting. All right. Well, as for me, I'm just going to do stuff this week, and I'm just not even going to worry about promoting it right now because I'm not feeling up to it. So I did listen to episode 1 of History Matters, and I can wholeheartedly recommend it to all of our listeners. Although it does make me feel inadequate that Pat is capable of putting out so much good stuff, as you all know. I do still listen to it and enjoy it. So go ahead and check that out. And thank you for checking out Heavy Hands. We'll be back next week with a regular episode as well as our second bonus episode of January. And thank you again to all of you who have done the $3 pledge and gotten access to those episodes. You've helped us out a lot financially. We've had a really great response, and we are looking forward to putting those out more and more in the future. So thanks to everybody for listening to those. Thank you for listening to this. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.